The wind blew low across the open plains, carrying with it the smell of rain and wild sage. The land was quiet except for the cry of a distant hawk and the slow beat of a horse's hooves against the hard, sun-baked earth. Out there, where the red rocks met the horizon, a solitary rider moved like a ghost from another world. His long black hair whipped behind him, tied with a strip of rawhide. The war paint that had once marked his face was gone, washed away by years of silence. He was an Apache warrior who had lived 15 years without touching another soul, without a word of kindness, without the warmth of a woman's hand. For most folks, 15 years is a lifetime. But for him it had been a punishment. Once he had a family, a tribe, and a reason to fight. Then came the raids, the soldiers, and the long winter of loss that took everything he loved. Since then, he had chosen the high country, where men didn't follow and women didn't stay. His cabin sat deep in the mountain pass, built from rough timber and Apache skill. The roof leaked, the door leaned, and yet it was enough. It was a place where no one asked questions, and the past could lie buried beneath the snow. Every sunrise was the same. He woke before the light, stoked the fire, and listened to the whisper of the pines. He hunted, trapped, and traded with a nearby settlement once or twice a season. Folks in town called him the Lonely Apache, though most had never seen him. Some said he was a spirit. Others swore he'd once saved a settler family from raiders. No one knew for sure, and he liked it that way. He spoke little English, trusted no man, and carried memories heavier than any saddle. Then, one morning in early spring, the silence broke. The sound came first, a creaking wagon wheel fighting through the mud. He stood outside his cabin, a rifle resting across his arm, watching as a stagecoach far off course rattled up the rocky trail. It was rare for anyone to come this way. The mail route had been abandoned years ago after attacks and broken bridges, but there it was, bright in the sunlight, paint flaking, horses foaming at the bit. The driver was shouting, struggling to control the team. Then from inside he heard a woman's voice, soft, scared, and out of place in that wild land. When the coach lurched to a stop, the driver jumped down, his face pale. "Wrong trail," he muttered, spitting into the dust. "She's supposed to be headed for Fort Stanton. Guess the map was wrong." The door swung open and she stepped out. She was small, dressed in a pale blue travel dress, her bonnet tilted to one side. Dust clung to her skirt and her gloves were torn. But there was something in her eyes, a mix of fear and quiet determination, that stopped him cold. She looked around the lonely clearing, the rough cabin, the endless pines, and then at him. For a moment their eyes met and something shifted. She didn't flinch, even though she knew exactly what he was. A warrior, a stranger, a man who had lived too long in the wild. "I was told I'd be meeting my husband here," she said softly, her voice trembling but polite. "They said he'd be waiting in these mountains." He said nothing. The wind moved through the grass, whispering between them. The driver scratched his neck uneasily. "This here's some kind of mix-up. The letter said cabin by the ridge, but I didn't expect an Apache." She turned to the driver. "You're sure this is the place?" He nodded. "Far as I can tell. I can't go no farther. Storm's coming, and I've got orders to head south." The woman's lips pressed together. "Then I'll stay." The driver stared at her like she was mad. "Ma'am, you can't mean that. There ain't nothing up here but wolves and snow." "I'll be fine," she said firmly, though her voice cracked on the last word. She looked at the warrior again, as if trying to read the truth in his face. "He'll understand." The warrior's brow furrowed. He didn't understand a thing. All he saw was trouble, a woman far from home, left in a land where mercy came slow. The driver shrugged helplessly, climbed back onto his seat, and snapped the reins. The stagecoach rattled away, leaving her standing in the dust with a small trunk at her feet. The mountain wind tugged at her bonnet, and she steadied it with one gloved hand. He watched her in silence for a long while. She didn't move, didn't speak, just looked around with a strange calmness like someone who had run out of places to go. Finally he stepped forward. "No man here," he said quietly, his voice deep and rough from disuse. "You go back," she shook her head. "The stage is gone." He looked down the trail, empty, quiet, already swallowed by the trees. He exhaled slowly, turned, and pointed toward the cabin. "You wait there. Storm comes." Her relief showed only in her eyes. She gathered her skirts, lifted her small trunk, and followed him. The cabin's door creaked open, and the smell of smoke and cedar filled the air. He lit another log in the fire and moved aside. She stepped in, looked around at the simple room. One bed, one table, walls lined with old weapons and drying herbs. "You live here alone?" she asked. He nodded once. She hesitated, setting her trunk by the wall. Then I'll only stay till the weather clears. My husband, he's expecting me. The words hung heavy between them. He turned away, pretending not to hear, but her voice lingered in his mind long after the fire crackled down to embers. That night, rain came hard against the roof. She sat by the fire, hands clasped, eyes distant. He worked silently at the table, sharpening his knife. Now and then he caught her watching him, curious, cautious, but never afraid. She asked no more questions and he offered no explanations. Yet something in the air had changed. The cabin, long cold and forgotten, felt alive again. Outside, the river swelled from the rain, roaring through the canyon. A wolf howled somewhere in the dark. He looked at her once more, her face soft in the firelight, and for the first time in 15 years, he felt something stir deep inside, a memory of warmth, of touch, of what it meant to be human. But the mountains were not kind to dreamers. He knew the law of this land. Strangers didn't just appear by mistake. Something was wrong. When dawn broke, he found the tracks, fresh ones, coming down from the ridge. Not from the stage, but from horses. 3 men, maybe 4, had followed her trail. He studied the ground, the bent grass, the way the hoof marks circled near his cabin. Someone had been watching during the night. He turned back toward the door, where she stood holding a cup of hot water, unaware of what the tracks meant. The wind caught her hair, and the morning light made her look almost unreal, like a spirit caught between 2 worlds. He stepped closer, his voice low and tense. "You tell me truth," he said. "Who follows you?" Her face went pale, her hands trembling slightly. I don't know what you mean." But he saw it in her eyes, the flicker of fear, the secret she hadn't spoken. The mistake that had brought her here wasn't a mistake at all. And in that moment, as thunder rumbled again in the distance, he realized his years of solitude were over. Trouble had come to his mountain, wrapped in blue silk and soft words. He looked toward the ridge, then back at her, knowing that whatever story had begun that morning wasn't ending any time soon. The lonely Apache warrior had been left alone for 15 years. But the wind had finally carried something or someone that would change everything he thought he knew about peace, pain, and love. And before the next storm passed, blood or redemption would follow. The morning air was cold and sharp, filled with the smell of wet pine and earth. The warrior moved silently through the clearing, his eyes tracing every mark the rain hadn't yet washed away. He knew the land better than any map, and these tracks, fresh, heavy, circling near his cabin, told him more than any words. Whoever they were, they had stopped to watch. That meant they were hunting something, or someone. Inside the cabin, the woman tried to warm her hands by the fire. She hadn't slept much, her mind turning over everything that had happened since she left St. Louis. The letter she'd received had promised a new life, a husband waiting in the Western Territories, a small ranch, a chance to start over after losing everything back east. She'd trusted the agency, packed her few belongings, and boarded the stage without looking back. But when the driver left her here, at this lonely cabin with a man who barely spoke, something in her heart began to twist with doubt. What if this was all a cruel mistake? She watched him from the doorway as he crouched near the edge of the clearing. The way he studied the ground, the stillness in his body, it all spoke of someone used to danger. His long black hair was damp from the rain, falling loose around his shoulders, and his chest bore faint scars that caught the morning light. He looked both wild and calm, like the mountain itself, quiet until it wasn't. When he stood, he met her eyes and spoke in a low voice. "Men come last night." Her face went pale. "Men?" He nodded once. "Tracks by river. 4 horses. They look, not pass." "Are you sure they were following me?" she asked, her voice trembling. He studied her closely before answering. "They not come for me." She turned away, clutching her shawl. He could see the fear in her hands even though she tried to hide it. Something about her didn't add up. Her dress, though worn from travel, was finer than what a frontier bride could afford. Her speech was educated, her tone gentle but trained, like someone who had lived among people who measured their words. She wasn't the kind of woman to survive out here alone. Yet she had chosen to stay when the stage left. He walked past her, placing wood in the fire. "You tell me truth," he said quietly. "Why you come?" She hesitated. "I came because I had nowhere else to go." He waited, saying nothing, but the silence pressed her to speak again. "I was told I'd marry a man named Ward, a rancher near the mountains. They said he lost his wife and needed help. The agency arranged everything. I sold my things to pay for the passage, but when I reached the fort, There was no one waiting. Then the driver said the name was on his list, and that he knew a cabin by the ridge. So I came, he turned to her. Ward, no man here by that name. She swallowed hard. Then who are you? He didn't answer. Instead, he tossed another log into the fire and stepped outside again, scanning the ridge. The forest was quiet now, but the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. He'd lived too long with silence to mistake it. When he returned, she was unpacking a few small things from her trunk. A worn Bible, a photograph, a folded letter sealed with wax. He glanced at the picture. It showed a young man in uniform, standing stiff and proud. She quickly closed the trunk when she noticed his gaze. My brother, she said softly. He died in the war. I suppose that's why I thought I could start over out here. To leave behind the graves and the noise. He nodded once but didn't ask more. Loss was a language he understood too well. By afternoon the storm had passed, leaving the ground slick and the air heavy with mist. She helped gather kindling near the stream, her skirts dragging through the wet grass. He worked beside her, silent as always, but she began to notice small things. The way he cut the wood so cleanly, how he checked the tree line every few minutes, how his movements were never wasted. This was a man who survived because he knew how to listen. When she slipped on a rock and caught herself against his arm, he stiffened slightly. It had been so long since anyone had touched him that even the brief contact felt strange. She drew back quickly, murmuring an apology, and he nodded without meeting her eyes. For the rest of the day they worked in quiet rhythm, two strangers trying not to trespass on each other's past. As evening fell, smoke curled from the chimney, and the smell of rabbit stew filled the small cabin. She sat near the fire, her hair falling loose from her bonnet. He watched her as he stirred the pot, remembering another time, another woman, who had once sat by his fire, long before the soldiers came. The memory was painful, but it also stirred something he thought had died. You live here long? She asked after a while. 15 winters. Alone? He looked at her, his eyes steady. Alone is better than war. She lowered her gaze, unsure how to reply. The crackle of the fire filled the space between them. After they ate, he went outside to check the horses he kept tethered near the creek. The moon was high, throwing silver light over the valley. The air was too still. He crouched near the water and found what he'd feared. Hoofprints, half-washed by rain but fresh enough to be real. Whoever was tracking her hadn't left. They were waiting. Inside, she sat by the table reading the letter from her trunk again. The words were beginning to trouble her. Something about them no longer seemed right. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the promises too vague. A good man with land, seeking a wife to share his life in peace. But there was no name, no clear address, only a mark and the agency's stamp. Could it have been forged? Was she being lured for some other reason? When the door opened, she startled. He stepped in quietly, but his face was tense. Men not gone, he said. They wait. She rose, her breath quick. Who are they? He shook his head. Not soldiers, not riders from fort. Maybe bounty men, maybe worse. She pressed a hand to her chest. Why would they follow me? I've done nothing wrong. He studied her for a long moment. Maybe they follow gold. Maybe they follow secret. Her eyes widened. I have no gold, no secret. He didn't argue, but the doubt in his expression made her uneasy. That night he didn't sleep. He sat by the window, rifle across his lap, watching the tree line. The firelight flickered over his face, showing the old scars that told of battles fought long ago. Each sound outside, the snapping twig, the rustle of leaves, brought back instincts honed by years of survival. She lay awake on the bed, pretending to sleep, listening to the rain begin again. Somewhere in the darkness, a branch broke. She sat up, fear rising in her throat. He motioned for silence, his hand raised. Then, like a shadow, he slipped outside. Minutes passed like hours. The cabin creaked. The fire hissed. She waited, staring at the door until his shape reappeared in the doorway. 2 men, he said quietly. Near ridge. They watch. What do they want? He looked at her with something like pity. You tell me truth now. Tears welled in her eyes. I told you everything I know. I don't understand why they're here. He turned away, jaw tightening. Then we find out come sunrise. When dawn came, the fog was thick and low. He took his horse and rode toward the ridge, leaving her with a warning not to open the door for anyone. The forest swallowed him up, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt the weight of the wilderness pressing in. Every sound outside made her heart jump. By midday, he hadn't returned. She paced the floor, her hands cold despite the fire. Then she saw it through the window, a dark shape moving between the trees. A man, then another. They were coming closer, rifles in hand, whispering to each other. Her pulse pounded. She reached for his knife on the table and held it tight, her hands shaking. The doorknob turned once, slow and deliberate. Then a knock, 2 firm raps against the wood. "Ma'am," a voice called, smooth and deep. "We're looking for a lady traveled up this way. Blonde hair, blue dress. We mean no harm." She froze, saying nothing. The voice came again. "We just want to make sure she's safe. Heard she got left behind by the stage." Another voice laughed softly. "Safe ain't the word I'd use." The doorknob turned again, harder this time, and just as the latch started to give, the sound of a rifle cracked through the air. One shot, then silence. The men outside cursed and ran for cover. She dropped to the floor, trembling, clutching the knife to her chest. The door swung open, and the warrior stepped inside, smoke still curling from his rifle. His eyes met hers, fierce, alive, unshaken. "They find you," he said. "Now we ride." Before she could speak, he tossed her cloak toward her and loaded his weapon again. The quiet life he'd built, the solitude he'd guarded for 15 years had shattered, and she, this stranger with secrets and sorrow, was at the heart of it. He looked out into the mist one last time before closing the door. "They come again," he said softly, "and when they do, we must be ready." The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was just beginning between them. They left the cabin at first light, the air thin with mist and pine. He saddled his bay with quick, practiced hands and tied her trunk with rawhide. She clutched her shawl tighter as he guided her toward the narrow deer trail that ran along the ridge. The valley below lay quiet, but the quiet felt wrong, like a held breath. He didn't speak. He only watched the tree line and the sky, reading the shapes of clouds and the language of birds. When a jay started up near the creek, he made a small sign and turned uphill instead, trusting the wild more than any road. They climbed to an old burn scar where lightning had taken the pines years ago. From there he could see the country spread out like a map. The stage line wound pale along the flats. The fort sat low and mean against the scrub. Closer, near the bend of the river, he saw fresh smoke. Not a campfire. Wet brush burned to throw off scent. He knew the trick. Hunters used it when they wanted the wind to lie about their place. He squinted and counted shadows. 3 men, maybe 4, same as the hoof prints. They had time to circle. He led her into a draw thick with quaking aspen. The leaves brushed their shoulders as they moved. He stopped at a fallen log and pushed it aside to reveal a cache he'd hidden years ago. Inside lay a rolled blanket, a coil of jerky, spare flints, and a small buckskin pouch. He took the pouch and slipped it into his belt, then left the rest. His eyes scanned her face for a moment, not unkind. She was tired, but a hard kind of brave. He had seen folks fall apart at less. She kept her breath steady and did what he told her. That counted for much in the high country. "Why do they want me?" she asked as they walked again. "If I am not the bride they expected, why follow this far?" He didn't answer right away. He was listening to the land, but he was also listening to her voice, weighing truth and fear in equal measures. When he finally spoke, it was slow and careful. "Maybe man named Ward is not man. Maybe name is bait. Maybe they wait for wrong woman and take any to trade for something." "Trade for what?" she whispered. He looked at the river bend. "Leverage." They reached a shelf of red rock and paused. From there, the river carved a white seam through the canyon. He chose a game crossing he knew from the elk trails. The spring flood was still strong, but here the current broke hard against a black boulder, leaving a pocket where hooves could find purchase. He took her reins in one hand, his horse in the other, and motioned, "Stay close. If water take you, hold my arm. Do not fight river. Float with, not against." They stepped into the winter melt. The cold hit bone. She gasped, then set her jaw. The current tugged at her skirts. He moved slow and steady, planting each step as if he could see the stones. Midway, a log swept past, spinning. She stumbled and grabbed his forearm. He did not flinch. The muscle under her fingers was like the river rock itself, carved by wind and time. They reached the far bank with numb feet and wild hearts. On the sand, they rested. He wrung his hair with an absent hand and looked up canyon. A hawk circled once, then twice, as if marking them. He cursed under his breath and led them into the shadow of the rocks. "They not cross where we crossed," he said. "Too strong. They take forward. That gives us time." She nodded, shivering. "Time to do what?" "Learn why they want you." By noon, they had slipped into an old lava tube near the high mesa. The roof hung low and cool, and the air smelled of dust and basalt. He hid the horses in a pocket of brush and set a single snare at the mouth of the cave. Not to catch a rabbit, but to tell him if someone entered. He gathered dry chips and coaxed a small smokeless fire for tea. She wrapped her hands around the tin cup, grateful for the heat. He took the folded letter she carried and studied it under the gray light. The paper was stiff, like it had been sealed more than once. The words were plain, promising a ranch and a quiet life. The mark at the bottom caught his eye. It was not a signature. It was a brand, 2 bars and a broken circle. He turned it so the lines faced north, and then he knew. He had seen that mark years ago on a wagon door near the salt flats. Men with cold eyes stood by that wagon. They traded more than cattle. They traded secrets and people. Agency is wrong kind, he said, setting the letter back. Her throat tightened. A sham, he gave a slow nod. Not all. Some help lonely men and lonely women find a place. Some help worse men find what they want. He pointed at the brand. These men take money from men like Ward. If Bride says no, they take her back and sell list of names to others. If Bride carries something they want, they take that too. She touched the small locket at her throat without thinking. It was the one thing she had not packed into the trunk. A keepsake from her mother. A cheap oval with a lock of hair. She felt foolish the moment she did it, but he had already seen. His gaze held, quiet but sharp. What is inside? He asked. Hair. 2 tiny pictures. She paused. And something else, I think. He waited. When I was packing, the clasp stuck. I pried it open and found a thin piece of paper tucked behind the photo. I did not think much of it then. It looked like part of a map. I was late to the stage, so I slid it back. I meant to forget it, but now I can't stop thinking of it. He let out a breath that could have been a laugh if it hadn't sounded so tired. Map brings men like winter brings wolves. He gestured gently. Show me. Her fingers shook as she opened the locket. Inside, pressed behind the faded pictures, lay a sliver of parchment, brittle and stained. It held no words, only a crude line and a small drawing like a star placed near a canyon bend. He knew that bend. Every river in this country had its secrets, and men who came east to west dreamed of one thing more than a home. They dreamed of metal hidden by the earth. He folded the parchment again and slid it back, not to keep it, but to keep others from seeing it. Your mother gave you this? He asked. She said my father worked a claim with 2 partners before I was born, she said. They were chased off by a flood. She never spoke of it again. After she died, I found the locket among her things. I wore it for comfort, not for wealth. I did not even know there was a map at all. Someone knew, he said. Someone watched you back east. Someone paid for the letter. They expected to collect you at the fort without noise. Then the storm and the wrong trail brought you to me. To a man they did not plan for, she murmured. To a land that speaks before men do, he said. Outside, wind hissed across the rock like a blade being drawn. He rose, went to the cave mouth, and crouched. Far off he saw riders on the ford. 4. One wore a red scarf that marked him as the talker by the fire. The leader rode a paint with a dark face. He sat too straight to be a simple outlaw. A hired hand from the fort, maybe, or a man who had worn a badge once and decided it paid too little. He returned to the small fire. We not ride for fort, he said. If we go there, they wait. If we go to town, they have eyes. If we run blind, river takes us. We go to people who owe me favor. Your tribe, she said softly. My people are scattered, he answered, and the words held the weight of broken treaties and old grief, but not gone. There is a woman who keeps a trading place near the hot springs. She sells blankets and needles to settlers and gives corn and news to those who need both. She knew my mother. She will help us read this paper the right way. They waited until the light started to fade. Then they moved through shadow to shadow, skirting the cottonwoods, leaving no straight line for a tracker to read. As they crept along, he taught her small things. How to step where he stepped. How to place the flat of her hand to the ground to feel for a distant team. How to break a twig under a rock so it looked old if someone checked their back trail. These lessons were quiet, almost tender, as if passing on skill was a way to keep fear from taking root. When they reached a limestone shelf above the springs, he signaled for stillness. Voices drifted up, faint and careful. He recognized the tone before the words. Traders talked like that when they did business they wished to leave off the books. He slid along the rock, then motioned for her to wait and dropped over the lip with a cat's control. Below, 2 pack mules stood tied near a mud pool that steamed in the cool air. A woman with iron-gray braids stirred a kettle hung on a tripod. 3 men stood across from her, one with the red scarf, one thin as a willow wand, and the leader on the paint, reins looped over his arm. They were not here for bath or trade. They were here for rumor. He lay flat and listened. "Past the ridge," the red scarf said. "Saw prints, 2 sets, one small like a lady's boot." "He's got her." The leader's voice was calm, almost polite. "Then we ride soft. This man knows country better than we do. If he wants to keep her, we'll have trouble. But a man living alone in the mountains keeps simple habits. He'll seek help from the nearest soul he trusts. That's you, ma'am, so help us. There's a bounty to collect for returning a lost woman to her rightful escort." The woman with the braids didn't look up from the kettle. "You boys use pretty words to cover ugly work. Work pays," the leader said, not proud, not ashamed. "The lonely Apache warrior saved my cousin's boy from a river some years back," the woman said. "He takes no payment and asks no thanks. If he brought a woman near here, it is not to sell her. It is to shield her from what rides behind you." The leader's jaw tightened. "We're taking her back. That agency has paper in order. The rancher paid for a bride, and the bride goes where the paper says. Paper burns faster than truth," the woman said. Up on the shelf, he closed his eyes at the sound of her voice. It held the old canyon patience, the kind that did not bend for wind or gold. He slid back to the lip and gave a soft click. The woman's head turned a fraction. That was all he needed. He motioned for the bride to follow him along a narrow goat path that snuck behind the spring house. They moved in silence until they reached a cleft where the rock split like a book. Inside, the trading place showed itself in pieces. A rough counter, sacks of flour, a crate of tin cups, a bedroll rolled tight and tucked under a bench. The woman with the braids stepped in from the steam and closed the door behind them. Her eyes were sharp, but her smile was warm and plain. "You took your time," she said to him. "And you brought Thunder with you." "Thunder followed her," he said. The woman looked at the bride. "Child, you carry something others wish to own." The bride nodded, hand at her locket again. The woman touched her wrist gently, lowering it. "Do not show it. Men are drawn to shine even when it is hidden." Outside, hooves clinked on stone. The leader's voice drifted closer, still polite, still wrong. The woman poured tea for all three and spoke under the sound of the boiling kettle. "There is a route through the rocks, a slot the size of a deer's rib. I can show you to the mouth, but not beyond. That country belongs to wind and memory. He knows it. They don't." He turned to the bride. "Once we go in, we cannot turn fast. If they catch us, we stand and fight." She lifted her chin. "I did not come west to be traded. I will not go back. Our path is not straight," he said. "Neither is my fear," she answered. "It bends, but it does not break." The woman with braids searched their faces and gave a single nod, as if this was the answer she had waited to hear. She drew a leather cord from her neck, a token hung with shells and a small stone. "Your mother would want you to live long enough to decide what this map means, not have the decision made for you. Take this. It carries the scent of home against the nose of a hound." He slipped the token into his palm and felt its heat as if it had been waiting for him. Then the clink of a spur outside scratched across the moment. The leader's shadow passed the thin gap beneath the door. The woman lifted the kettle and set it down hard to cover the sound of breath. "Out the back," she whispered. "Follow the narrow cut. Do not touch the walls. They crumble and sing to trackers. Step on the spine stones only." He took the bride's hand for balance, just once, steady and firm, and they slid into the slot. It was a dark throat of rock, cool and close, with a ribbon of light high above. Their shoulders brushed the sandstone. The scent of wet mineral filled their lungs. Every step demanded trust. Dust sifted down with each scrape. Far behind, a boot scuffed and a voice muttered. A stone ticked. Then another. The red scarf laughed, a sound with no joy in it. They reached a place where the slot opened to a hidden shelf above a box canyon. The view was wild and secret. 1,000 years of wind had carved a maze no map could hold. He crouched and pointed out 3 routes with his finger in the dust. "That way leads back to river. That one to the high pass. This one to a hollow where we can watch and not be seen." "Where does the star on the parchment lie?" she asked. He touched a spot between the second and the third lines and did not answer. The star was too close to where they stood for comfort. If he spoke it, the canyon might carry his voice to the wrong ears. They moved to the hollow. It smelled of rabbit and sage. He dragged brush across their path with a quiet sweep. Below, the riders spread out like ink and water, testing each corridor of stone. The leader removed his hat and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. He did not look up, but his posture said he felt eyes on his neck. The bride sat very still beside the warrior. Her breath slowed to match his. In the quiet, she understood something about him that had nothing to do with scars or silence. He had made a life where the world could not hurt him only by becoming part of the world that hurt. Rocks, wind, water, hunger. He trusted them because they were honest. Men were not. Sunlight slid along the canyon wall like a blade. The red scarf pointed at the spring house with his rifle and said something the wind stole. The leader nodded and turned his horse to the east. They were making a guess, and it was a smart one. If they chose right, the slot they took would bring them above the shelf where the two now waited. He stood and tightened his belt. "We move again," he said. "Before they get smart twice." "Where to?" she asked. He tilted his head toward the place where the canyon bent like a question, toward the star. They stepped into the tightening light, every sense awake, each footfall a promise that nothing would be simple. Behind them, somewhere in the folds of stone, the leader gave a short whistle, sharp and certain. It bounced off the walls and came back smaller, but not less sure. The sound slid over their skin like cold metal. The chase was tightening. The map was no longer a secret, and the path ahead would demand more than courage. The river would be louder. The canyon would be thinner. The truth would be closer. And before the next sunrise, someone would learn whether the star on the parchment marked gold or a grave. The canyon grew narrower as the sun slid behind the cliffs. The sound of water was distant but constant, echoing through the stone like a heartbeat. They moved carefully along the ledge, the horse's hooves muffled by the sand. The warrior led, his hand always near the rifle. The woman followed, clutching her shawl against the wind that tore through the cracks like a warning. Every step carried weight now, not just from the chase, but from what they both knew was waiting ahead. Somewhere in this maze lay the star on her mother's map. Somewhere close, men hunted for it too. As they reached the bend, the sky darkened to copper. He stopped and crouched, studying the ground again. "3 riders," he said quietly. "Not far," she swallowed, her heart pounding. "How do you know?" He touched a broken sage branch and pointed toward a print half buried in sand. "They follow the wind wrong. They learn trail by dust, not by spirit. But they close." They moved faster after that, weaving between walls of stone where shadows deepened. She could feel the pressure of time closing in on them. The warrior didn't speak, but his every glance carried meaning. When they reached a small hollow beneath a cliff, he stopped and raised his hand. "We wait here," he said. "Night will hide us better than rock." She sat on a flat stone while he gathered dry brush to build a low, smokeless fire. The silence between them was heavy, filled with things neither dared to say. The flames flickered, showing his face carved by exhaustion and thought. She wanted to ask if he regretted helping her, but the question stuck in her throat. Finally, she said softly, "You've lived 15 years without company. You could have turned me away." He looked up from the fire. "Some things cannot be turned away," he said. "River, storm, or fate?" She lowered her gaze. "Do you believe fate brought me here?" "I believe what the wind carries has a reason," he said simply. "And the wind carried you to my door." For a long while, neither spoke. Outside, coyotes began to cry across the ridges, their voices rising and falling like sad music. The woman's hands trembled as she reached into her pocket and unfolded the small parchment again. "This map. My father must have hidden something worth dying for." He stared at the faint line and the star symbol burned into the yellowed paper. "Maybe not gold," he said. "Maybe something men call gold." Her eyes met his. "What do you mean?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Long ago, soldiers and miners came here. They took land, stone, and water. But before them, my people buried something else, something sacred. They used marks like this to keep others away. Maybe your father saw what he should not have." A chill ran through her. "Then those men chasing us?" "Want what he found?" he finished for her. The firelight caught her face, and he saw the fear there. He wished he could take it away, but he knew fear was sometimes what kept a person alive. Later that night, the wind shifted. He froze, tilting his head. Somewhere below, a rock slipped against another. Not a falling stone, but a footstep. He put out the fire with a handful of dirt and motioned for silence. They crouched behind the ledge. The darkness swallowed them, but she could hear her heartbeat thundering. 3 figures moved below, their voices low. "Tracks end here," one said. "They're close," another answered. "I can smell the smoke." Then came the leader's voice, calm, cold, certain. "Keep quiet. He's not like other men. He'll hear before he sees. We wait till dawn. Then we take her and finish this." Their voices faded as they moved toward the canyon mouth. The woman's breath shook. The warrior waited a moment longer, then whispered, "We move before light. They watch the wrong side. We take the high path." Before dawn, they were already climbing the slope behind the hollow. The path was steep and narrow, carved by time and storms. At the top, the ground opened into a wide mesa, silver under moonlight. From there, the canyon stretched below them, endless and wild. She could see the distant glow of campfires, 3 small dots burning against the dark. She turned to him. "They won't stop, will they?" He shook his head. "Not while breath stays in them." "Then what happens if they find us?" He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Then I finish what they started 15 years ago." The words lingered between them. She didn't know what he meant, but there was something in his tone that spoke of old wounds. They rode in silence until the sun began to rise. The light bled across the land, painting everything gold. He slowed near a cluster of boulders where the ground dipped into a dry basin. The rocks were marked with carvings, faded but deliberate, circles, hands, stars. He dismounted and ran his fingers over one of the carvings. "This place," he murmured, "is where my father brought me when I was a boy. He said the stars here guard the earth's secrets." She joined him, her breath catching at the sight of the markings. "The same star as on the map," she whispered. He nodded. "Yes, but it means more than gold." Before she could ask, his head snapped toward the ridge. A faint glint of sunlight caught on metal. "A rifle barrel! Down!" he hissed, pulling her behind a rock as a shot cracked across the basin. Dust exploded near their feet. The horses reared, panicked. He fired back once, then dragged her toward the shadows. The echo rolled like thunder. "Are you hit?" he asked. She shook her head, clutching her shawl. "No, you?" "Not yet," he said grimly. Another shot rang out, closer this time. The leader's voice carried over the canyon. "Give her up, warrior. She don't belong to you." He crouched lower, eyes hard. "They come fast now," he said. "We can't stay." They slipped into a narrow crevice between the rocks, moving single file. The air grew cooler and damper as they descended. The sound of boots and shouts echoed faintly behind them. The passage twisted until it opened into a wide cavern lit by shafts of morning light. At the center of the cavern lay a pool of clear water. The rock around it shimmered faintly with mineral streaks. Gold, or something that looked like it. The woman gasped. "This is it," she whispered. "The star on the map." He nodded slowly. "Your father found it. Not gold, but spirit stone. To my people it was holy. To others it was wealth." They stood in silence, both awed and uneasy. The place felt alive, as if it breathed through the earth itself. But the peace didn't last. The sound of boots on rock came from the tunnel behind them. "They found the trail," he said sharply. "We stand here or we die running." She turned to him, panic in her eyes. "There must be another way out." He pointed to a crack high in the cavern wall. "Light comes through there. Maybe an opening." Before they could climb, a shadow fell across the entrance. The leader stepped into view, his rifle aimed steady. Behind him came the red-scarfed man and another, guns drawn. "Well," the leader said with a slow smile. "Looks like the lost bride and the mountain ghost found their treasure." The warrior said nothing. His hand rested on the knife at his belt. The man's eyes shifted to the woman. "You know what's funny? That locket around your neck. Been following it for years. That map wasn't just your father's. It was government property once. Some said it led to an old Apache gold vein. Others said it was cursed. Either way, I'm getting paid." She stepped back, her voice trembling. "You'll have to kill us first." The man's grin widened. "I was hoping you'd say that." The warrior moved before the words had settled. He lunged low, grabbing the barrel of the rifle and twisting. The shot went wild, shattering a rock behind them. Chaos filled the cavern. Shouts, dust, the smell of gunpowder. She ducked behind a boulder, clutching the locket in both hands. The red-scarfed man fired, grazing the warrior's arm. He didn't flinch. The knife flashed once, and the man stumbled back, clutching his shoulder. The leader swung his rifle like a club, catching the warrior across the jaw. Both men hit the ground, rolling near the edge of the pool. "Stop!" the woman cried, stepping forward. "You'll destroy everything." The leader turned his gun toward her. "That's the idea." He never fired. The warrior tackled him, driving him into the rock wall. The rifle clattered away. The two men struggled in the dust, fists and fury, until the leader grabbed a sharp fragment from the ground and slashed. The warrior caught his wrist, twisting until the sound of bone snapped filled the air. Then came another sound, the faint crumble of stone. A crack snaked up the cavern wall as dust rained from above. The pool rippled, the water trembling like glass. "Run!" he shouted. She hesitated, but the roof began to groan. He shoved her toward the light crack in the wall. "Climb!" She scrambled up the rocks as chunks of stone fell around them. Behind her, the leader reached for his pistol with his good hand. The warrior turned, blood running from his temple. Their eyes met for an instant, one filled with rage, the other with something deeper, older, unbroken. The pistol rose. She screamed his name, and before the sound finished echoing, the canyon floor gave way with a roar that swallowed everything. The gunshot, the shouting, the gold-lit water, all buried under thunder and dust. The sound of the collapse echoed through the canyon until only silence remained. Dust filled the air like smoke, blurring the world into shades of gray. The woman lay on the ledge near the upper crack, her hands bleeding from the climb, her lungs burning. For a long moment she didn't move. She waited for another sound, a voice, anything. But the cavern below stayed quiet except for the settling of rock and the faint hiss of falling sand. Her heart felt like it was beating somewhere far away from her body. When she finally looked down, she saw only broken stone where the pool had been. She called his name, once, then again, her voice echoing into the hollow that had swallowed him. There was no answer. The only sound was the wind returning through the crack like a sigh. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to move. The light from the gap above seemed closer now, and with what strength she had left, she climbed through it, scraping her arms against the stone until she pulled herself into open air. Outside, the morning had broken wide over the desert. The sun climbed slow behind the red hills and the land glowed gold with dust and heat. She stumbled a few steps before sinking to her knees, staring at the canyon mouth below. Smoke drifted up where the ground had fallen in. She pressed her hands over her face and wept quietly, the locket still warm against her chest. He had saved her again. Hours passed before she could move. The ache in her chest didn't fade, but she knew she couldn't stay there. He had told her once that the land always gives what it takes away, and somehow that thought steadied her. She followed the ridge until she reached a narrow trail that led back toward the springs. Every step hurt, but she kept going knowing he would have wanted her to. By dusk, she reached the small trading post run by the gray-haired woman with the braids. The old woman was waiting outside as if she already knew what had happened. She didn't ask questions. She just helped her inside, gave her water, and cleaned the blood from her hands. "He's gone," the woman whispered at last. The trader nodded slowly. Men like him never truly go. The mountain keeps them close. The woman looked down at her locket, clutching it in her palm. "He saved my life." "He didn't have to." The trader poured tea into a tin cup and set it beside her. He did what was right, not what was easy. That's what makes a man worth remembering. For a few days she stayed there, too weak to travel. The trader told her stories about the warrior's youth, how he'd once been known among his people for his courage, how he'd lost everything in one winter when the soldiers came, and how he'd lived alone ever since. Each story made the ache in her chest grow heavier, but it also brought him closer. She began to understand that the loneliness she'd seen in his eyes wasn't emptiness. It was the weight of love that had nowhere left to go. On the third morning, she went outside and found a figure standing at the edge of the springs, wrapped in the mist. For a heartbeat, she thought her mind was playing tricks. But then he turned and she saw his face. He was alive, though pale and bruised. His arm was bound with cloth and there was blood dried along his jaw. The trader had found him at sunrise, half buried near the canyon mouth, alive by the smallest of miracles. The collapse had carried him into a lower pocket of rock, and he had clawed his way out before the dust had settled. When their eyes met, neither spoke. She ran to him, the locket glinting in the sun, and he caught her in his good arm. For a long time they stood there saying nothing, letting the world breathe again around them. "I thought you were gone," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I was close," he answered softly. But the mountain didn't want me yet. They returned to the cabin by the ridge together. It was still standing, though the storm had torn branches across the roof. The fire pit was cold and the woods were quiet. He worked in silence to repair what time and weather had broken, and she helped where she could, sweeping out the dust, patching the old window with cloth. It was as if they both understood that fixing the cabin meant fixing something deeper, something between them that words couldn't reach. As the days passed, they began to speak more freely. She told him about her life back east, about the loss that had driven her to answer that letter, and about how she had hoped to find a place where she could belong. He listened, always patient, his dark eyes thoughtful. In return, he told her of the years he'd spent in solitude, the wars he'd fought both on land and inside himself. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the mountains, she held the locket in her hand and said quietly, "That map, It led us to danger, not treasure. But maybe that was its purpose. Maybe my mother left it so I'd find something more valuable than gold. He looked at her for a long moment before replying. Sometimes the land hides what hearts are ready to find. Maybe that was her way of bringing you here. After that, the world outside seemed to soften. The riders were gone, the canyon had closed upon its secret, and the air grew calm again. Travelers passing through the region later told stories of a strange collapse in the mountains that had sealed off an old cavern rumored to hold lost gold. None ever found it again. The land, it seemed, had decided to keep its secret buried for good. The woman stayed on for the season, then another. Together they planted a small garden behind the cabin, near the stream where the willows grew. The trader visited sometimes, bringing supplies and laughter. The warrior began to smile more, though only in quiet moments when the day ended and the light turned soft. She learned that peace didn't come from what you found, but from what you learned to hold on to when the storms were done. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sky turn to silver, she asked him, "Do you ever think of leaving this place? Of starting somewhere else?" He thought for a moment, then shook his head. A man can't outrun what's already part of him. The mountain knows my story. It's safer in its hands than anywhere else, she smiled faintly. Then I suppose I'll have to stay too. Someone needs to make sure you eat more than jerky and beans. He gave a quiet laugh, the sound low and rare. Then stay, he said. The land will welcome you if your heart is true. Seasons changed again. The cabin grew stronger under their care. Sometimes travelers would stop by, lost or weary, and find food, warmth, and a story told by a quiet man with long dark hair, and the woman who had once arrived by mistake. They never spoke of the map or the gold again. The locket stayed on the mantle, its secret locked away, its purpose fulfilled. In time, the woman came to see that fate wasn't something written in letters or carved in stone. It was the crossing of two paths that were never meant to meet but did. And from that meeting came something rare, a second chance at life for both of them. Years later, when the mountains grew old around them, the locals still whispered about the lonely Apache warrior who had lived apart from the world until a lost bride changed everything. They said he'd once fought men for gold but chose love instead, and that the land itself had forgiven him for every battle he'd ever fought. On a soft spring morning, long after the dust of those years had settled, a rider passing through stopped at the ridge cabin. He found two graves marked with river stones and wildflowers. The smaller stone bore the carving of a star. The larger one beside it had no name, just the symbol of a hand and a circle, the sign of peace in Apache lore. The rider stood there for a long time, hat in hand, before he turned and rode on. Behind him the wind picked up, whispering through the pines and across the old canyon where the gold had once glimmered. And if a person listened closely, they might have heard something else carried on that wind, a voice calm and strong, saying that love once found never truly dies. It only changes its shape. In the heart of the wild land, where rivers still ran free and the stars watched from their ancient places, the legend of the lonely Apache warrior and the mail-order bride lived on, not as a tale of gold or fate, but of redemption, of two souls who found home in the last place they expected, inside each other and in the silence of the mountains that had once kept them apart.